Family and friends, if I could have your attention. Friends, just as a gentle reminder, if anybody has a cell phone, if you could please take a minute to turn it on silent. In just a few moments, we are going to begin the service for Dr. Irving Cutler. On behalf of the family, I want to thank those of us who are here in person as well as those who are joining on the live stream. Officiating our service today is Rabbi Alan D. Kensky and Rabbi Nate Crane of Beth Hillel B'nai Emunah. Our service will begin this morning with the Navy Honor Guard.
Honor Guard, mid-pin, cut, post. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having us today. It is our great honor to be here. If you are able to easily and comfortably stand, we ask that you please rise for military honors. If you have served, we invite you to join us in rendering a final salute during the sounding of taps. Geographer, sound taps. Thank you.
I begin with the 23rd Psalm. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar. Binoteshe yarbitzeni al mei menuchot yinahaleni. Nafshi shovev yancheni v'magle tzedek leman shemo. Gam ki elech begeit salmavet, lo irara ki ata imadi. Shivtecha umishantecha hema yenachamuni. Taroch lefanai shulchan neged sorerai, di shanta vashemen roshi kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yerdefuni kol yemei chayai, v'shavti beveit Adonai le'orech yamim.
We join together in the English, which can be found on the inside of our folders. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And now I will share a reading from the book of Ecclesiastes. L'kol zman ve'et l'chol chefetz tachat hashamayim, et laledet ve'et lamut, et l'ta'at ve'et la'akor natua, et laharog ve'et lirpo, et lifrotz ve'et livnot, et livkot ve'et lischok, et svod ve'et rekod, et lehashlich avanim ve'et kenos avanim. To everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to slay and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to cry and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time for solitude, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time for silence and a time to speak. From the book of Job. Talmid chacham imet mi mevi lanu timurato. There is no replacing a person of wisdom. There are mines for silver and places where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from the rock. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the source of understanding? There is no replacing a person of wisdom. There's no replacing Dr. Irving Cutler. Almighty God, whose mercies are from everlasting to everlasting, to you alone do your children turn for refuge in their affliction, for comfort from the grief that burdens the spirit, for peace from the sense of solitude and loss, and for strength of the soul in trouble. O you divine comforter who loves us with an everlasting love, and who turns the shadows of night into the cloudless day that dawns, please help these mourners. As we read the words of promise of eternal life, let them be filled with hope that love dies not, that righteousness is mightier than the grave, and that the legacy of a shem tov, a good name, is the most enduring memorial we can leave behind. Let this hour be for them a time of consecration to resolve so to act that through their love and chesed they may reflect honor upon him who is so dear to them in life. And together we say, Amen.
Today is Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, when we mourn the destruction of both the first and second temples of Jerusalem, with all the death and suffering wrought at those times, and we lament the exile of our people from the land of Israel that followed. Here today, as we come together to bid farewell to our beloved Dr. Irving Cutler, we mourn the loss of a great son of our people. Indeed, the unofficial historian of our Chicago Jewish community, who in his century of life taught and inspired thousands and touched many through his unique tours that made history come alive. Above all, today a family mourns the loss of its beloved patriarch, a most beloved father, grandfather, uncle and great-uncle, and special friend, for whom family was always central, who loved his whole family deeply, and in turn felt their love to his dying days. Irv Cutler, born in 1923, lived a full century. His life mirrored the dramatic changes that occurred as the Jewish immigrant generation established itself and thrived in the city and suburbs of Chicago. What made Irving Cutler a great historian of Chicago's Jewish community was that its history was also his story. Irv was gifted with an uncommon curiosity for the world around him, a great eye for detail and the storyteller's flair. And above all, he had the ability to tell history as a human story of people with interesting lives and whose lives were part of a much larger story. Irv wrote up his memoirs in a volume specifically created for his family called From Varshilivka to Wilmette, a beautiful volume that tells the story of his family's migration from the Ukrainian Shtetl of Varshilivka to the United States and the subsequent life of his extended family here. Irv was born in Chicago, in the Maxwell Street neighborhood, to Zelig and Frida Cutler, and he was the only one of their 5 children born in the United States. His 4 sisters were born in Ukraine. Their father, Zelig, had come to the United States first to raise funds to bring over the rest of the family. A common story. The rest of the family left Ukraine in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the pogroms that then ravaged Ukraine. The family overcame numerous and harrowing obstacles as they fled Ukraine. But Irv's mother would not give up, and eventually the family made it to Chicago. With 4 older sisters who doted on him, Irv wrote that at times he felt that he had 5 mothers. Irv's first language was Yiddish. He learned English when he began school. The family was poor, and Irv's first job was working for his father at a newsstand that he ran in a part of the Loop that was then known as Skid Row. In that neighborhood, Irv encountered an interesting cast of characters, and he wrote that he learned a great deal about life in general while working there during the years of the Depression. The newsstand was a hub of political discussion, which certainly rubbed off on the young Irving, and his avid newspaper reading probably dates to those days. Until the past several months, he would read 3 newspapers daily. The Cutler family moved to Lawndale, then center of the Chicago Jewish community. Irv attended school in Lawndale, graduating from Manly High School and later attended Herzl Junior College. Irv was interested in all of Chicago, and he explored the far reaches of the city by bus, the L, and other trains. Irv captured the vitality of Jewish life in Lawndale, in the Jews of Chicago, and Chicago's Jewish West Side. Irv studied at the University of Chicago for 3 years before the United States entered World War II. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Navy and was enrolled in an officer's training program, which took him to Dartmouth, Columbia University in New York, and Ohio State University. Once commissioned as lieutenant junior grade, he served on an escort destroyer that accompanied convoys of troops on 10 cross-Atlantic voyages. Among the many things for which we remember Irv today is his devoted service to our country during World War II. After the war, Irv returned to his studies at the University of Chicago, earning a master's degree in social science. He began his career in teaching as a high school teacher in Bridgman, Michigan, and later taught high school in Chicago. He held many other interesting jobs, including as manager of the Greyhound bus terminal, a fitting position for him given his long-standing love of transportation. Irv met Marion at a Zionist summer camp, and after a courtship of almost 2 years, Irv's mother said, "Genug schon," enough already, and Irv and Marion married in a small ceremony in August 1951. Theirs was a beautiful marriage of 53 years. Marion shared Irv's love of travel, and together they traveled around the world more than once, visiting 6 continents. Marion supported Irv in all his professional activities. She edited and typed his manuscripts. She accompanied him on his tours, where her home-baked cookies were always favorites. Irv and Marion were deeply devoted to one another, and Marion's passing was a great blow for Irv. But Irv showed resilience, and his love of life remained unabated, and he was blessed in being introduced to Arlene, who became a special friend, sharing with Irv his love of culture and their love of family. When Irv and Marion moved to Wilmette in 1957, some relatives thought that they were moving to the wilderness. They were founding members of Beth Hillel, and for a while Irv served on the congregation's board. Irv completed his PhD at Northwestern in urban geography, and his academic career took off. He taught at Chicago Teachers College, now known as Chicago State University, for 24 years, serving as head of the geography department for 10 of those years. Irv was a devoted teacher and mentor to many. His love of Chicago, its history, neighborhoods, infrastructure, and above all, its people, propelled his writing of Chicago, Metropolis of the Mid-Continent, which has been published in 4 editions. Irv was a board member and president of the Geographic Society of Chicago and received the Distinguished Geographer Award from the Illinois Geographic Society. He was a founding member of the Chicago Jewish Historical Society, and just this past April was honored by the Board of Jewish Education at their own centennial celebration, with the Ledor Vador Award. Though physically frail, he made it to the event, and his son-in-law Job read the words that he prepared for the event. In his message, Irv shared memories of Maxwell Street and Lawndale and reflected on his life as a teacher. I will quote from Irv's words. There are many ways of being a good teacher, being an inspiration in the classroom, writing books and articles about important subjects, or firsthand showing people the world around them, which I was lucky to do for decades. To me, teaching has been the most enjoyable, rewarding, and fulfilling experience of my life. I love giving tours and talks of Jewish Chicago. Though I gave my final ones in 2019 when I was 96, I still think of them often. They live on frequently in my mind and in my dreams. In my years of knowing Irv, what struck me the most was his utter modesty. He was a mensch, a true treasure of a human being. Never did he boast of his accomplishments or honors. He was a true font of knowledge when it came to Chicago history and politics. To the end, he was deeply concerned about the goings-on in Israel and the rest of the Jewish world, and in American politics. He and I shared many interests, and as I said to the family the other day, there was no one else I could speak to about the vote for the progressive candidate La Follette in the heavily Jewish wards of Chicago in the presidential election of 1924. Irv Cutler was absolutely one of a kind. Irv was a wonderful, loving father to Danny and Susie. Growing up, he and Marion took them on many a fun summer journey to all corners of the United States. He sent them on scavenger hunts and took them to watch the trains. Busy as he was, he always made time for them. He adored them and was proud of them and their accomplishments. And in turn, they were deeply devoted to him. Over the past 7 months, they sat alongside him day and night, supporting him, encouraging him, reading newspaper articles to him, holding on to him. Irv is mourned deeply today by Danny, by Susie and Job. And Irv was deeply devoted to and proud of his grandchildren. He followed their lives with great interest. He took them out on outings to the train stations. He spent time with them and always enjoyed listening to them. He was a strong influence on Carl and Lee of blessed memory, and on Sam and Ram. Irv is mourned today by Carl and Vicky, by Sam and Ram. Irv's passing is a great blow for his whole family. Today, Tisha B'Av, is a time for mourning. But by afternoon, the mood in our liturgy shifts as we introduce the theme of comfort at our Mincha service. And on this coming Shabbat morning in our synagogues, we will read the words of the prophet, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort ye, my people, says your God. Irv left us a powerful legacy, an example of a life lived fully, and he enriched our lives in so many ways. His writings will continue to be read, and the story of his life will continue to inspire. And most powerfully, Irv will continue to live on in his family. You will continue to tell the story of Irving Cutler. You will share your many stories of him and the stories you heard from him for years to come. And he will be alive for you as you share these stories. And having been touched so deeply by him, part of him will live on in you. You will carry his name and memory proudly with you wherever you go. May the soul of Irving Cutler, Yechiel ben Zelig Ufreda, be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Tehi nishmato tzrura b'tzror hachayim. Now call on members of Irv's family, beginning with Irv's daughter, Susie Cutler.
I was hoping that I would never have to write a eulogy for my dad. He is such a remarkable man and has lived a full and beautiful life, surrounded by people he loves and who love him. I can't possibly express all that he meant to me. I feel like my own sense of myself is tied to who my dad was, and I feel like I have lost a part of myself with his passing. I am his proud daughter. People always come up to me and say how much they loved my dad's tours and talks and books, that he brought back beautiful memories, and they are grateful that he documented their history, the history of Jewish Chicago. I'm sure many of you are familiar with my dad's Jewish tours. I don't know exactly how many times I've been a passenger on one of those tours, but I'm pretty sure I'm the current record holder. And I loved every minute of them and always learned something new, as did my kids, who were lucky enough to also go on many of his tours. You saw the city differently after one of his tours. My dad did these trips by heart, no notes. But as many times as I've been on them, I still couldn't give the tour or come close to being able to share all of the stories and information. Maybe it's because I'm just the daughter of the person who has embodied Chicago's Jewish history for the past 100 years. He lived that history, born in Maxwell Street area, growing up in North Lawndale, living in Hyde Park when he went to University of Chicago, and then to the northern suburbs. And he was the best teacher. His curiosity about places started when he was a boy, when he decided that he would ride all of the bus and streetcar lines in Chicago. And he walked the streets as a newsboy and later covered the city as a cab driver. He said he didn't pick up too many fares, as he just wanted to drive around and explore the city. He joined the Navy because he thought it would give him a better chance to see the world than the other military branches. A couple of years ago, one of his former students, Aaron Williams, contacted him. He had taken geography courses from my dad in the late 1960s. He wrote that thanks to my dad's outstanding geography courses, he learned about and developed a great appreciation for the world outside of the South Side of Chicago, and gained a global perspective that has guided his career for some 50 years since he graduated. He went on to become the director of the Peace Corps under President Obama. He said that he's often thought of my dad when responding to the question of how did you decide to pursue a career in foreign affairs? In response, he always mentions my dad as one of his key early mentors who put him on this path. I don't think my dad realized how many lives he has touched. When we were kids, he took us on amazing summer vacations across the country by train or car, from dude ranches to World's Fairs, from the Smoky Mountains to the Montreal Expo, from Key West to San Francisco. And he always stopped to take picture slides along the way to document our travels for his classes. We learned so much from him. He was also a very sensitive soul. He lived with cats for the past 60 years. Mimi, Kitty, Simon, Josie, Rusty, and Mishka, and always had cheerful conversations with them. He loved feeding the critters that visited his backyard. Every night he would throw bread outside to see who would come. He would call us over to take a peek when the raccoons, possums, and skunks came to dine. I attribute my lifelong compassion for animals to my dad. And he maintained friendships with two of his grade school friends, Julie and Herb, who both turned 100 this year. He would speak on the phone or on Zoom calls with them regularly. The physical therapist came into the room during one of these calls and couldn't believe that 200-year-olds were Zooming. Julie's daughter, on hearing of my dad's death, wrote, "What a great man your father was, brilliant, kind, generous, and filled with a deep understanding of humanity. We were all fortunate to know him." And he was always there for the family. He loved hearing what his grandsons were doing, what Carl was doing on the bookmobile or where he was flying the plane, what Lee was doing in his BBYO group, how Sam's classes were going or getting exercise tips from him, hearing about Ram's cross-country tour and listening to him play his favorite Yiddish songs. He asked Ram to make an album of Yiddish and other ethnic songs. Ram thought that was a good idea, and hopefully he will. He was so proud of his grandsons, and he loved them so, and they'll miss his stories about growing up in Lawndale, working at his dad's newsstand, his World War II Navy stories, his world travel stories as he explored 6 continents, talking about the White Sox, Bears, or Bulls. And after 53 joyful years of marriage to my mom, Marion, my dad was heartbroken when she died in 2004. Some Shul members, Sashi and Irwin, fixed him up with Arlene, and they hit it off immediately. Arlene is a warm, caring, beautiful person who always lifted his spirits and made sure there were pickles on the dinner table for him. He was lucky to spend many years enjoying her company. His life was filled with love, and he helped me find the love of my life. In my teenage years, I didn't pay much attention to Job. I thought he was too young for me. My dad gently suggested I give Job a chance, that he was a gem. So I did, and he was right. Besides chronicling the history of the Jews of Chicago, he also wrote a memoir for his family chronicling our history. He knew how to tell a story. During the past couple of weeks when my dad was in the hospital, I was reading the memoir to him. It is a story of a remarkable life and an important family record. I thanked him again and again for writing it for us. What a gift he gave us. He leaves an enormous legacy. His passing is the end of an era for our family, as he was the last surviving member of a family of immigrants, except for him. My cousin Perry thinks that the secret to their long lives was that they each ate a half of a banana a day. It didn't matter how big the banana was. As his grandniece Lisa described my dad so beautifully, he lived such a long life, but more than that, his life has been filled with integrity, intellectual stimulation, community, and so much love. I know that as you travel about Chicago in the days and years to come, you'll be reminded of so many stories of your dad. His spirit will forever remain a part of Chicago and a part of you. Dad, it's hard for me to say goodbye to you. Who's going to give me a Susie? I love you so much, and I'll miss you terribly. Thanks for everything. May you rest in peace.
Thank you, Susie. Now call on Irv's son-in-law, Job Silverglade.
I am going to do the best I can to make a few remarks about Irv and his life, even though I'm certain that Susie and Danny would be able to provide you with more detail, greater insight, and surely more heartfelt commentary about their dad. But I have to start with a few comments about Susie and Danny themselves, since I think Irv would want me to start there. Over the past 3 years, and really going back a few years earlier than that, Susie and Danny have dedicated their lives to giving Irv every opportunity to live out the last years of his life to the fullest because he had given so much to them. With the help of Susie and Danny, Irv attended plays and concerts, attended Chicago Jewish Historical Society meetings on Zoom, chatted online with relatives like Leah and Perry in Haifa and Zohar and Elsa in Paris, made significant trips like to Paris for Amos's bar mitzvah in 2018, and a trip with Danny up Mount Washington in New Hampshire not that long ago, among many more trips and activities. Their unyielding dedication to making sure all of his healthcare needs were met every single day through every single office visit extended his life and quality of life. And I am just scratching the surface here in terms of their efforts. It's not to say that there were not moments of tension between them, such as when Susie's judgment, or at times overbearing concern, conflicted with Irv's sense of independence. When that happened, Irv's sense of frustration could boil over into a reddened face and a muffled scream that went something like this: "Susie!" But that rare burst of frustration never turned sour and was always extremely short-lived, because you knew that Irv loved Susie and Danny more than anything else in the world and appreciated their level of care and concern. At the same time, he might have objected to it. The point is this: Irv was one very loved and very special dad. All you needed to add to that caregiving was Irv's zest for living and a strength that is beyond measure. He continued to read voraciously, finding new favorite authors like Edna Ferber, a 1925 Pulitzer Prize winner, and new favorite books like Where the Crawdads Sing, and then made sure to see the movie version in the theater with Arlene. He continued to write and publish articles in the Jewish Historical Society's newsletter in 2020 and 2021 at the youthful age of 98. And just 3 months ago was there to receive the Lador Vador honor from Generation to Generation from the Board of Jewish Education at the time of his 100th birthday on the top floor of the Doubletree Hotel, which was something Irv had put on his calendar in the fall of 2022 and was absolutely committed to attending. How do you concisely eulogize someone who has lived for 100 years with Irv's level of accomplishment? Maybe it starts with the conclusion: it was a life well lived. There were no barriers for Irv, physically or metaphorically. He traveled to the Amazon rainforest, where Marion said you could be driven crazy by the cacophony of wildlife shrieks and calls. To China, where they were both swarmed by the locals as oddities with blonde hair in the early years when travel to China first opened up. To Australia, where Irv hiked up Ayers Rock in the desolation of the outback. To India, where as a young geographer, Irv hiked up the foothills of the Himalayas to get a view of Mount Everest. To Russia, where he and Marion rode the Trans-Siberian Railway and were followed in Moscow by the KGB while making secretive drops of prescription medicines. To Cuba before Castro, where he thinks he and Marion were picked up while hitchhiking by Ernest Hemingway. To Israel on many occasions, to the Mediterranean on a cruise when he was in his 90s, I believe, with a demanding side trip to the pyramids with Danny, to Europe with Fritzi and Dudi, where Irv many times recalled Dudi unabashedly pulling out a shofar on one of the Jewish holidays and trumpeting away on the train, to Eastern Europe on a Beth Hillel-sponsored trip, and frequent travels with geography colleague from DePaul, Dick Hauk, who passed away about 10 years ago. And it was all documented, since Irv famously took slides of his trips and converted them all into travelogues and lectures, with each finely edited presentation mostly taking just short of an hour. It was nearly an everyday thing to see him loading his projector and his retractable mobile movie screen with tripod stand into his Ford Taurus trunk for another engagement. It's my guess that alone he must have given his West Side Lawndale Jewish history lecture with slides hundreds of times. The first minyan took place in 1845, comprised of the bare minimum 10 men, at this corner, Wells and Lake Streets, right above a store. Irv never went digital for these presentations, though he did manage to merge into the computer age, reading and writing emails, checking stock prices, and somehow learning to click on a mouse without moving the cursor off the target. On that recent trip I mentioned earlier to Mount Washington in New Hampshire, which is known as the windiest place on earth, after taking a train ride well up the mountain, and while Danny was taking a quick look around, it seems that Irv decided to take a trail up to some higher point on his own, with the winds blowing harder and harder, 50-mile-per-hour gusts or stronger. Irv pressed on until he required some assistance from fellow tour members to safely navigate the trail back down. At the end of that trip, he received the tour group's highest honor. Here's another question. Where does one attain fearlessness? I have only considered from a distance how the military experience might impact the individual. And I have surmised that crossing the Atlantic, keeping a lookout for German submarines from a destroyer escort, as Irv did as a Navy officer during World War II, where the ship in heavy seas pitched to near 90 degrees and then snapped back to center, might leave you less concerned about something like gusting winds on an exposed mountainside. On a smaller scale, maybe that's why he would never hesitate to get into his aging Ford Taurus and drive in a snowstorm to pick up Arlene for a movie date in Highland Park. I always thought that was a little crazy, but maybe it was just that he did not want to miss the date. I was thinking that maybe that fearlessness helped him face growing health challenges without complaint. Arlene has said many times to me, "Job, he never complains, so how can I complain?" And so Arlene never complains. Maybe if some of you here today were lucky enough to be around Irv regularly enough, that fearlessness might have had a chance to rub off on you. He was the kind of person to share it with you if he could. He was always supportive in whatever venture you may have been engaged, and especially supportive of Carl, Sam, and Ram, always asking how things were going with the library, or the physical training classes, or the musical world. He never lost his supportive inquisitiveness, asking my sister Naomi detailed questions at the hospital and Whitehall Nursing Home in recent months about recent developments at the Ark and its new building, as though the information about this social services agency needed to be incorporated into another tour or article. And Irv was the eternal optimist with a simple world view. We needed to beat back evil. Social ills could be solved by applying humanitarian principles, not by diminishing others, or allowing racial prejudice, or equally vile anti-Semitic political strains to gain any foothold in our contemporary politics. This really disturbed him, and his record of political donations proves it. He normally read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chicago Tribune every day, and he remained connected to the news of the world, with Susie and Danny reading articles to him nearly every day right up to the day he died. He wanted to know how Ukraine was faring in its war against Russia. I think I can fairly say that Irv was not a very religious person, but he was a firm believer in the concept of tikkun olam, the healing or repairing of the world. For example, when he brought a Jewish tour group to a black church that was once one of Lawndale's synagogues, replete with Jewish iconography both in and on the building, the visit was obtained out of mutual respect, with the pastor giving a brief presentation and perhaps a brief question and answer session for both. If Sunday services were ongoing, the group would tiptoe in and tiptoe out. Irv always presented it as a shared space, and now a shared history, with the unspoken message that different peoples were not so different, and that the television news was not the only and definitely not the best source of information about any neighborhood. He was genuinely proud of and loved his own Jewish community and related stories that spoke to this feeling. You may have heard these on his tours. While passing a certain street corner on Roosevelt Road, back in the late 30s and 40s, when the Bund would show up and cause trouble on a city beach trying to hassle or keep Jews out, Irv would explain, Davy Miller and his pool gang from this location would head over and rectify the situation. Another one of his favorite highlights on the West Side tour was passing the Multipurpose Jewish People's Institute, or JPI, in North Lawndale, which had a summer roof garden dance every Sunday night. Irv once met a woman from Elgin who was on one of his tours and who told him that almost every weekend she and a friend would take the electric train into Chicago to attend the roof garden dance at the JPI because there weren't enough eligible Jewish men in Elgin. Irv went on. She came and she came and she danced until she finally caught one up there. Many a shidduch were made at the dances. It was the original J-date. As Irv wrote in the preface to his best-selling The Jews of Chicago, From Shtetl to Suburb, it is said that knowing where you come from will often help you understand where you are going and why you think, feel, and act the way you do. If this book helps to achieve even a part of such an understanding, it will have served its purpose. Hopefully, the knowledge and insights you have given us all will temper the loss of your passing, Irv. But there will remain a gaping hole where you once stood, and we will all be missing you.
Now call on Irv's grandson, Carl Cutler.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Over the past few days, I've been trying to find the right words to say about my grandpa. And I spent a big chunk of the day yesterday writing and deleting because I couldn't find the right words to say. Nothing seemed meaningful enough to me. And as I lay awake in bed last night, late, thinking about it, it hit me, and that was candy. Grandpa always had candy, and just a small microcosm of how wonderful and great he was. There was always a candy dish at the house, or whenever he would put on his cap for us to go out on some adventure to a museum or to scout out a tour in Chicago, I would be given a caramel in a gold wrapper. Anytime we sat down in the car, there was never a shortage of candy. I thought for the longest time that maybe he was sponsored by Werther's Original or had some deal with them. But it wasn't just for us, for those who were lucky enough to be his close family. It was for everyone. On his tours, when Grandma would bake her incredible chocolate chip cookies, and even if she weren't attending on the tours, those cookies became world famous. And despite Grandma's distaste for how much candy he would ply us with, he still would manage to sneak us candy time in and time out. And that's something that I'm always gonna love and cherish, because who doesn't love candy? He would play with his grandsons in the yard for hours on end. I remember him trying to teach us to play tennis, although none of us ever really picked up on tennis, although Sam and Rom got pretty good at it later on. But when we were younger, it just seemed more like baseball, so eventually he switched it to a baseball bat. His fearlessness, as Job spoke of, really came to pass when, as we got a little older and a little stronger, he would pitch the ball to us and never be too upset when he would take a comebacker right to the mound off of his back. And even at that age, he was very quick. He loved Chicago. He loved his beloved White Sox. And although somewhere along the way something went wrong and I became a Cubs fan, the greatest thing, and I know there's a lot of division amongst Cubs and Sox fans, was that we could always talk baseball. And he loved so much to talk baseball and football and basketball. And regardless of how either team were doing, we could talk about the goings-on. And it made me so happy every time. my wife, Victoria. I've known her most of my life, and she's known Grandpa for almost as long. And I remember when Victoria and I got engaged and we went to Grandpa's house, and the tears of joy in his eyes, something that will live on with me forever. If I could just say one thing to everyone here, it's thank you. Thank you for letting my grandfather into your life. Thank you for letting me into your life. Thank you all for being part of our extended family. And I love you all. Love you, Grandpa.
Now call on Irv's grandson, Sam Silverglade.
Hi, everyone. The memories and experiences I've shared with my grandfather are too numerous to count, but it's the smallest interactions that hold the most profound significance, from backyard wiffle ball games to first train rides to watching Chicago Bears football games. Always knew when the Bears were on defense because he'd be in the family room yelling, "Get him!" I'll never forget a valuable lesson he taught me when I was very young, and this is one of my earliest memories just in general. I think I was about 5 years old. In Skokie, Grandpa and I were getting on the Skokie Swift L train to literally just ride the train to the Howard stop and back. And he knew I really enjoyed riding the train. And in a moment of regrettable impulsiveness and ignorance, I mistakenly and assertively asked people to vacate their seats, even though there were plenty of other available seats on the train car. He very quickly and sternly corrected my behavior and made me realize the inappropriateness and insensitivity of my actions. When someone defies all the odds and lives such a long, full life like my grandfather has, somehow, no matter how much time you spend with them, it feels like you still want more. Now, I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have had ample opportunities to spend precious moments with him. A privilege not all grandsons get to enjoy, but it's not just about the quantity of time, but the meaningfulness of our interactions that truly matters. And ultimately, the way we experience people is how they make us feel. And our heartfelt interest in what I had to say and what I was doing really meant a lot. When I doubted my significance, he made me feel deeply valued. And his unwavering dedication to listening and understanding further emphasized the worth he saw in me. This wasn't just a once-in-a-while thing either. Every encounter with him left me feeling confident, socially adept, and genuinely good about myself. So with that, love you, Grandpa, and we'll miss you.
And now call on grandson, Ram Silverglade.
Last summer, Zohar, our cousin, took me to the Korean spa. We had just come from my grandpa's house, where we had sat around the kitchen table listening to him tell stories about our family and his childhood. Afterward, for some reason, the thing Zohar wanted to do most is go into the hottest of the hot baths of the spa. And after settling into the heat for a minute, he said with a sudden seriousness, "You are so lucky to have him." I knew what he meant, but when you're born lucky, it can be hard to see just how lucky you are. It had always been normal for me to have a grandpa like Grandpa. a grandpa who walked through the house with history in his heart, who knew Chicago like one of his own stories and was so eager to share it, who could tell you what Douglas Park smelled like one summer night when everyone decided to sleep outside together, or would recall the first and last names of his Depression-era classmates, eyes glistening with nostalgia, while you sat there firing off more and more questions about what it was like. When he told these stories, it was as if he was a mosaic artist, setting small tiles into place one at a time. And if he sat at that kitchen table long enough, you could begin to see a much bigger picture coming into focus. A picture of a childhood that only he held in his memory. He told stories of the drunk who'd come by Yashin Brothers and about the Navy officer who dropped his wallet in the latrine. He'd laugh about the time his 6th grade teacher asked him to run out and fetch her fur coat for a hot date she had that night. He'd describe the cast of regular characters at the newsstand he worked at with his dad, remembering every one. He recalled that the hooker spoke Yiddish and that each day the Iceman would roll by with his cart and chip off a sliver or two of ice for the kids. He'd talk of the pianist who scored movies at the Yiddish Theater, Aunt Bella at the garment factory, Becky at the rubber plant, the weekend dances. He'd tell stories about the lakeside where I would later spend my childhood, or describe falling sick at the cabin there and how my grandma showed up miraculously the next day in a snowstorm and waited till he got back, knowing she was in the right cabin only because the milk on the table was still warm. He could tell you which synagogues have been turned into churches and which luxury apartments used to be fruit stands. Or he could tell you the story of the 4 sisters making their way across Europe, or how Rose lost the bucket with the false bottom and his mother flicked chickens to make ends meet while Zelig sat in the hospital with his leg broken in 2 places. He'd describe his time at sea, road trips with friends, the feeling of closing the shop at night, and the baseball games he and his classmates would round up every day after school. Each story my grandpa told was just a piece of that larger picture he had in mind. A colorful city of faces and lives, a vast mosaic mural that took 100 years to piece together. And each time we'd visit, we'd get another glimpse of it and remember where we came from. It is a rare and precious thing to come into the world and feel a strong sense of place. To be born somewhere and feel like you belong. To find yourself nestled warmly in the cradle of history, surrounded by a city that sparkles. To wake up nestled in the cradle of a family, surrounded by people full to the brim with love. I realize now that this is a feeling I had, and that the sense of deep belonging was no coincidence. It was a gift given to me so lovingly by my grandpa. And this is why, as Zohar said, we are all so lucky. We were so lucky to have him. Last year, I sat down at the living room piano to play a few of Grandpa's favorite tunes. It had become a kind of lovely routine we had to pull songs from the Yiddish songbook and play them whenever I'd visit. As usual that day, my grandpa asked me to play Tum Balalaika. It was one of the songs he grew up with, something he would sing with his sisters on the front porch some summer evenings. Having played it many times before, I didn't open the book this time. I knew the tune well enough and wandered my way through as usual, taking a few liberties and probably fumbling a few notes. But when I got to the end of my rendition that day, I turned around, and Grandpa was in tears. "You knew that all by heart," he said. "You didn't even open the book." "Of course," I said. I'd played it 100 times. "Really marvelous," he said, still teary. I understood then that nothing meant more to my grandpa than having the songs of his childhood, the songs of our shared history, played by heart. When I think about this now, I wonder if, in a sense, it meant he had done his job, or even that his job was done. Perhaps it is possible to hold the past in you like a song, to know it so well you know it by heart, to know the feeling of it, the colors of the mosaic tiles, the imperfect shapes they make, to hear the voices even without knowing all the words, or to hum the melody without knowing all the notes. This kind of musical knowing is a knowing deeper than memory, and it is beyond the possibility of forgetting. It is the song that plays for you when you're lucky enough to be loved by someone like Grandpa, and it is a song we all know by heart.
Please rise for the memorial prayer. El malei rachamim, shochein bameromim, hamtzei menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashechina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע, מזהירים, לנשמת יחיאל בן זלג ופרידה, שהלך לעולמו. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו, ההנה בעל הרחמים, הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר אמן.
El Maleh Rachamim, exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the soul of our dear Yechiel ben Zeleg Ufreda, who's gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace, and let us say, Amen.
Friends, you may be seated. Friends, this concludes our service here at the chapel. Interment will take place immediately at the family plot at Waldheim Cemetery in Forest Park. Following the interment, the family will be sitting Shiva at the Cutler residence, 3217 Hill Lane in Wilmette. That information and the times are available on the folder. If you did not receive one, they're available on the way out. And for those of you who are on the live stream, that information is available online. In addition, memorial contributions in Dr. Cutler's memory can be made to the Chicago Jewish Historical Society, Jewish United Fund, and Orphans of the Storm. For those of you going in procession with the family to the cemetery, please make sure you obtain an orange funeral safety sticker. That sticker should be placed on the front passenger side of the windshield. We'd also ask that you have your bright headlights and flashing hazard lights on at all times. For an additional measure of safety, our staff will be placing magnetic flags on the tops of vehicles throughout the procession. As we drive in procession today, please drive as close as safety permits to the vehicle in front of you at all times. We want to avoid any large spaces or gaps in procession, particularly as we go through intersections. The following individuals have been selected to serve as pallbearers. When I call your name, if you could please stand next to Dr. Cutler's casket. Carl Cutler, Sam Silverglade, Ram Silverglade, Job Silverglade, Ethan Penn, and Victoria Sanders. If I can ask everyone to please rise at this time as we escort Dr. Cutler's casket from the chapel.